The forest was my sanctuary, a refuge where I could lose myself in the quiet beauty of the natural world. I'd parked my RV in countless places across the United States, always searching for the perfect shot, pristine landscapes untouched by time. But that night, deep in the heart of the Black Hills of South Dakota, something felt off. The day had been uneventful, though the usual serenity of the forest seemed muted. The towering pines swayed lazily in the breeze, their tops brushing the sky. Yet the sounds I'd grown accustomed to, the rustle of leaves, the rhythmic chirp of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, seemed faint, almost absent. I told myself it was the isolation playing tricks on me. After all, it had been weeks since I'd last spoken to anyone. I parked the RV in a small clearing, surrounded by dense trees that cast long shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon. The light faded quickly, painting the world in hues of blue and gray. I set up my camera, hoping to capture the brilliance of the stars later that night. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that nipped at your skin but left you feeling alive. After a simple dinner, I settled in for the night, the warmth of the RV a welcome contrast to the chill outside. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay there in the silence, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts as restless as the wind that occasionally rattled the RV. A faint sound broke the stillness, soft, rhythmic knocking. My body tensed. It was distant, almost imperceptible, as if it were coming from the trees themselves. I waited, straining to listen, but it faded into nothing. Just the forest, I told myself. Trees creaking, wind shifting, nothing more. I rolled over and closed my eyes, willing sleep to take me. But the sound came again, louder this time, knocking, deliberate and steady, accompanied by something else. A faint cry, high-pitched and fragile, like the whimper of a child lost in the dark. My heart raced. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? The nearest town was miles away. I reached for the flashlight by my bed and hesitated. The cries continued, each one cutting through the quiet like a blade. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to look outside. My fingers trembled as I pulled the curtain aside. At first, there was nothing but darkness. The beam of the flashlight cut through the night, illuminating the dense wall of trees. And then I saw it, movement between the trunks. A figure standing still, its outline barely visible against the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a child, nor anything else I could identify. It stood too tall, too thin, like a silhouette carved from darkness itself. And its eyes, two glowing orbs, impossibly white, stared back at me, unblinking. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam flickered briefly, as though the light itself were afraid to linger on the figure. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my fingers tightened instinctively around the curtain. I didn't dare move. The glowing eyes seemed to pierce through the thin pane of glass, fixing me in place like prey cornered by a predator. My mind raced with questions. Who, or what, was it? Was it even real? The figure didn't move, but the longer I stared, the more I noticed. Its outline was wrong, almost jagged, as though the shadows clung to it like smoke. The eyes, cold and empty, glowed brighter, contrasting sharply with the surrounding darkness. My skin prickled with a primal fear I couldn't explain. Suddenly the knocking resumed, this time on the side of the RV. My heart leapt, and I spun toward the sound. 3 sharp raps, deliberate and impossibly close. Someone or something was outside. I scrambled out of bed, fumbling for my phone. My hands shook as I swiped at the screen, but the dreaded no-service notification stared back at me. I was utterly alone. The knocking stopped. Silence pressed down on the RV, thick and suffocating. I strained to hear anything. Footsteps, voices, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive quiet. Slowly, I turned back toward the window, afraid of what I might see. The figure was gone. For a moment, relief flooded through me. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe my exhaustion and the isolation had gotten to me. But the reprieve was short-lived. A low, guttural sound, a mix between a growl and a moan, rose from somewhere outside, chilling me to the bone. The sound vibrated through the RV, resonating deep in my chest like a warning. I grabbed the flashlight and, against my better judgment, opened the door. The cold night air rushed in, biting at my skin. I stepped onto the ground, the beam of the flashlight darting nervously across the clearing. The forest loomed like a wall of black, the trees stretching upward into the void of the night sky. The growling had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness that felt unnatural. Hello? My voice barely rose above a whisper. I wasn't sure if I was calling out to whoever or whatever was there, or just trying to convince myself I had the courage to face it. My words disappeared into the darkness, swallowed whole by the trees. And then I saw it again. The figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half concealed by the shadows. It was closer now, its glowing eyes locked onto me. My flashlight flickered, as if it were struggling to stay alive. My chest tightened, and I stumbled back toward the RV, slamming the door shut behind me. The growling returned, louder this time, reverberating through the walls. I could feel it in my bones, a primal vibration that made my hands slick with sweat. The RV shook slightly, as though something heavy had collided with it. My breathing came in ragged bursts, and panic clawed at the edges of my mind. I turned the key in the ignition, my only thought to get out of there. The engine sputtered to life, but the headlights barely pierced the darkness. As I shifted into gear, the RV rocked violently, and I caught a glimpse of the figure through the rearview mirror. It stood directly behind me, its eyes glowing with a haunting intensity. My stomach churned as a wave of nausea and terror washed over me. The growling ceased, but the silence that followed was worse. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was an unnatural void, like the world itself was holding its breath. I gripped the wheel and floored the gas, the RV lurching forward onto the dirt path. Gravel crunched beneath the tires, and the headlights bounced wildly as I sped away from the clearing. But even as the RV roared down the narrow road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The forest pressed in on either side, the trees rushing past like ghostly sentinels. My mind replayed the image of those glowing eyes, and no matter how fast I drove, I felt them watching me, burning into my soul. The road stretched endlessly before me, its narrow, winding path carved into the darkness. My hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, the weight of fear pressing down on me. The image of those glowing eyes was seared into my mind, their unblinking stare haunting every corner of my vision. My chest ached as I struggled to control my breathing, but the gnawing terror wouldn't relent. The forest outside seemed alive, the towering trees closing in with each turn. Shadows danced in the periphery, twisting and shifting like they were mocking my escape. The RV's engine groaned with the strain of the uneven terrain, and I prayed it wouldn't give out. Every bump and jolt felt like the road itself was conspiring to throw me off course. Suddenly, the headlights flickered. My pulse spiked as the world around me plunged into near darkness. For a moment, the beam returned, illuminating the narrow path ahead, but then it faltered again, this time for longer. The dashboard lights dimmed, and I swore under my breath, slamming my hand against the wheel. Not now. Not here. The RV sputtered and jerked violently before the engine cut out completely, leaving me stranded in a sea of black. My heart sank. I was alone, miles from civilization, with nothing but silence and shadows for company. I fumbled for my flashlight, the weak beam barely pushing back the encroaching darkness. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring into the void. The oppressive quiet weighed on me, amplifying every creak of the RV, every whisper of wind through the trees. But then, faintly at first, I heard it. The knocking. Slow and deliberate, coming from the side of the RV. My breath hitched, and my flashlight wavered as I turned toward the sound. It came again, louder this time, 3 distinct knocks, as though whatever was outside wanted me to know it was there. My stomach churned, and my grip tightened on the flashlight. I wanted to scream, to tell it to go away, but my voice caught in my throat. The knocking moved, now at the back of the RV, then the other side. It circled me, the pattern deliberate, taunting. I couldn't stay there. I had to do something. Gathering what little courage I had left, I threw open the driver's door and stepped into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, the silence even heavier outside. My flashlight trembled as I swung it toward the noise, but there was nothing. Just the endless rows of trees, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Then I saw it. The figure stood in the middle of the road, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It was closer now, its form more distinct. The jagged outline seemed to shift and ripple as though it were made of smoke and shadow. My legs felt like lead, but some instinct deep inside me screamed to run. I stumbled back toward the RV, my flashlight clattering to the ground as I fumbled with the door. My fingers shook as I climbed inside, slamming it shut behind me. The growling returned, vibrating through the walls, growing louder and louder until it was deafening. The RV rocked violently as though an unseen force was trying to tip it over. "Leave me alone," I screamed, my voice breaking, but the growling didn't stop. It built to a crescendo, a terrifying symphony that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I curled into the driver's seat, covering my ears, my eyes squeezed shut, and then silence. I opened my eyes cautiously, my ears ringing from the sudden absence of sound. The RV was still. The growling was gone. Slowly, I looked out the window. The figure was nowhere to be seen. I tried the ignition again, and to my disbelief, the engine roared to life. Without hesitation, I floored the gas, the RV tearing down the dark road. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was away. The trees blurred past, and I didn't dare look back. Hours later, I reached the safety of a small roadside diner, its neon sign flickering invitingly. I parked haphazardly, stumbling out of the RV and into the bright, artificial light. Inside, the hum of conversation and clinking dishes grounded me, pulling me back to reality. I sat at the counter, trembling, as the waitress poured me a cup of coffee. "You okay, Han?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. I wanted to tell her everything, to unload the terror I had experienced. But as I opened my mouth, I realized I didn't know where to start. What could I say that wouldn't make me sound insane? So I just nodded, gripping the mug with shaky hands. The warmth seeped into my fingers, but it did little to thaw the chill that had settled in my bones. No matter how far I drove, how much time passed, I knew I'd never escape those eyes. They would haunt me forever. The countryside stretched endlessly before me, golden fields rippling under a pale autumn sun. As I turned off the gravel road onto the long, winding driveway, the farmhouse came into view. It was exactly as I had pictured it when I signed the papers, a weathered beauty standing against the horizon, its peeling white paint and sagging porch radiating a charm born of age. For the first time in years, I felt a quiet sense of optimism. This place, I told myself, would be my sanctuary. The air was crisp and cool as I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching underfoot. I stood for a moment, taking it all in. The house was surrounded by fields that seemed to stretch forever, interrupted only by a cluster of oak trees at the edge of the property. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and there wasn't another car or human in sight. Just the soft rustle of the wind and the occasional caw of a crow overhead. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and dust. The hardwood floors creaked under my weight as I carried in the last of my boxes, the sound echoing faintly through the empty rooms. The previous owner had left a few pieces of furniture behind, an old armchair, a rickety dining table, but the space was mostly barren. I didn't mind. It felt like a clean slate, a place where I could finally escape the noise of my old life. The first few days passed in quiet routine. I spent my mornings unpacking and my afternoons wandering the property, marveling at the solitude. Nights were a different story. The silence, which had seemed comforting during the day, became oppressive after sunset. The wind against the window sounded like whispers, and the groans of the old house stretched long into the night. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling, the way old places often do. Still, sleep came reluctantly. On the fourth night, I awoke to a sound that set every nerve in my body on edge. Footsteps. Faint but deliberate, moving across the floor above me. I held my breath, heart pounding in my chest, and listened. The steps were slow, uneven, as if someone, or something, was pacing the upstairs hallway. I reached for the lamp on my bedside table, but as my fingers brushed the switch, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt unnatural. I stayed awake the rest of the night, ears straining for the faintest hint of movement. The next morning, I searched the house thoroughly, starting with the upstairs hallway. I opened every closet, checked every corner, but there was no sign of anyone. The windows were locked from the inside, and the front door had been bolted all night. It didn't make sense. I tried to shake off the unease, chalking it up to the creaks and groans of an old house, but a part of me couldn't let it go. Something about the sound had felt intentional. That evening, as I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, I heard it again. This time, it came from the living room, a faint shuffle, like someone shifting their weight on the floorboards. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. Slowly I stood and moved toward the sound, my bare feet silent on the cool floor. The living room was empty, just as I'd left it. The old armchair sat by the window, bathed in the dim glow of the setting sun. But then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The rotary phone on the wall, an antique relic I assumed didn't work, was off the hook, the receiver dangling by its cord. I stared at it, confusion mingling with a rising sense of dread. I hadn't touched the phone since moving in. Reaching out, I lifted the receiver to my ear. Static greeted me at first, a faint hiss of white noise. Then, faintly, I heard it. A whisper. Low and guttural, like words spoken in a language I didn't understand. My blood turned to ice. I slammed the receiver back onto the cradle and backed away, my heart racing. The house, once so full of potential, now seemed to loom over me, its shadow stretching longer with each passing moment. Something was wrong here. Deeply, inexplicably wrong. I couldn't shake the sound of the whisper, its unintelligible cadence still echoing in my ears. By the time night fell, the farmhouse seemed to have grown colder, its empty halls amplifying the unease I felt. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a glitch in an old, disconnected phone. Yet, as I sat at my desk, staring blankly at the pages of my notebook, the words refused to come. My mind kept returning to the static, the murmurs, and the feeling that I was no longer alone. The night stretched on, the minutes crawling by. At some point, I realized I'd been holding my breath, straining to hear something, anything, out of place. And then it came. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the hallway upstairs. My heart dropped. I knew that sound. It wasn't the aimless creak of old wood settling under its own weight. Someone, or something, was walking above me. I stood, my legs trembling as I reached for the flashlight on the desk. The beam shook as I aimed it toward the staircase, half expecting to see a shadowy figure staring back at me. But the stairs were empty, disappearing into the darkness of the second floor. Gathering every ounce of courage, I forced myself to climb. Each step groaned under my weight, the sound magnified in the suffocating silence. When I reached the top, the hallway stretched before me, bathed in an eerie half-light from the moon filtering through the windows. It was empty. My breath came in shallow bursts as I moved toward the first door on the left, the one leading to the attic. My fingers hovered over the doorknob, hesitant to touch it. The whispers returned, faint at first but growing louder, more insistent. I pushed the door open. The attic was cold, colder than the rest of the house, and the air felt heavy, as though it carried a weight I couldn't see. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing old trunks, broken furniture, and scattered relics of a past life. At first glance, there was nothing unusual. But then, in the farthest corner, something shifted. The beam of light caught the faint outline of a shadow, darker than the rest of the room. It twisted unnaturally, folding and unfurling like smoke caught in a draft. My chest tightened as I realized the shadow wasn't cast by anything physical. It moved independently, defying the direction of the light. And then it turned toward me. I froze, unable to breathe. The shadow seemed to solidify, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape. It stood unnaturally tall, its edges jagged and undefined. From within the dark form, two pinpricks of light flickered, eyes that weren't eyes, staring directly at me. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chorus of guttural, alien sounds. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The shadow took a step forward, its movement silent and fluid. The oppressive weight in the air grew stronger, pressing against my chest like an invisible hand. The whispers became a deafening roar, drowning out my thoughts. With a surge of desperation, I turned and bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste. The hallway blurred as I stumbled back into the living room, slamming the door behind me. My lungs burned as I struggled to catch my breath, my ears still ringing with the phantom whispers. The house was silent again, but the oppressive presence remained. I grabbed my keys from the table and flung open the front door, stepping into the cold night air. The wind bit at my skin, but the familiar chill was a relief compared to the suffocating atmosphere inside. I turned back toward the house, its windows dark and lifeless. Yet, in the upstairs corner window, a shadow lingered, watching. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the car, clutching the flashlight and listening to the distant whispers that seemed to seep through the walls of the farmhouse. Something had made itself known, and I realized with dawning horror that it wasn't leaving. The morning sun broke over the horizon, but its light did little to dissolve the oppressive dread that hung over the farmhouse. My body was stiff from spending the night in the car, the flashlight still clutched in my hand. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow, a twisting, impossible form with glowing points of light where eyes should be. I had no doubt now. I couldn't stay here. I forced myself to re-enter the house, the stale air carrying a silence that felt like it was holding its breath. Each creak of the floorboards under my boots sent a spike of anxiety through me. My focus was singular. Grab my essentials and leave. Whatever belongings I couldn't carry would stay behind. They didn't matter anymore. The whispers began again as I packed, faint but insistent, rising from the walls like smoke. I worked faster, shoving clothes and papers into a duffel bag, my pulse pounding in my ears. As I moved toward the front door, a sound stopped me cold. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was the phone. The rotary phone on the wall was ringing. I turned slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The shrill, unnatural tones sliced through the house like a blade. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to ignore it, to run. But my feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the phone. My hand trembled as I picked up the receiver, holding it to my ear. Static hissed on the other end, broken by bursts of guttural murmurs. The whispers were clearer now, layered in a language I couldn't understand, but their intent was unmistakable. They were calling to me, drawing me deeper into the madness. And then, beneath the murmurs, a single word emerged, spoken in a voice that wasn't mine but filled my head with chilling familiarity. Stay. I dropped the phone, the receiver clattering against the wall. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, reverberating through the house like a rising storm. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with an unnatural weight. I stumbled toward the door, clutching my bag, but before I could reach it, the house itself seemed to react. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, pooling together like ink spreading across the floor. They moved with purpose, coalescing into a single form, tall, jagged, and utterly wrong. The shadowy figure stood in my path, its glowing eyes burning with a silent command. It didn't move closer, but its presence pressed against me, crushing and relentless. "I'm leaving," I shouted, my voice shaking. "You can't keep me here." The whispers roared in response, an unintelligible cacophony that filled every corner of my mind. I could feel the house breathing around me, alive with something ancient and malevolent. My chest tightened as panic surged through me. There was no reasoning with this. There was no understanding it. The only thing I could do was run. I darted around the figure, refusing to look at its shifting, impossible form. The air grew colder with every step, the shadows seeming to reach for me as I bolted through the door and into the sunlight. I didn't stop running until I reached the car, throwing my bag onto the passenger seat and starting the engine. Gravel sprayed behind me as I tore down the driveway, the farmhouse shrinking in the rearview mirror. But even as I put miles between myself and that cursed place, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. The air felt heavy, the whispers still faintly audible, as though they had followed me. When I reached the highway, I dared a glance in the mirror. For the briefest moment, I saw it, the shadowy figure standing at the edge of the property, its glowing eyes watching me go. I never returned to the farmhouse. I left everything behind, including the dream of peace and solitude I'd once held so dearly. I moved back to the city, but the memory of those whispers lingered, a stain I couldn't wash away. Sometimes at night, I swear I can still hear them, faint and distant, calling my name. The farmhouse sits empty now, a hollow shell that no one dares to approach. It waits, as it always has, for someone new to cross its threshold. And though I escaped with my life, a part of me will always remain there, trapped in the shadows with the thing that dwells within. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed. I learned that too late. When I first moved into the small house on the edge of town, it felt like a sanctuary. The quiet neighborhood, with its wide streets and distant neighbors, promised the solitude I had been craving. The house itself was modest, a single story with a cozy porch, surrounded by a patchy yard that I promised myself I'd eventually fix up. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. After years of chaos and noise, I thought I had finally found peace. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. My days were spent at work and my evenings were filled with simple pleasures, reading on the couch, watching old movies, and experimenting with recipes in my small, slightly outdated kitchen. The silence at night was comforting, almost like a cocoon wrapping around me. I loved the way the stars seemed brighter out here, away from the city lights. But over time, I began to notice small things that unsettled me. It started with the porch light. One evening, I came home to find it flickering, even though I had replaced the bulb just days before. The next morning, there were faint footprints in the dirt outside my kitchen window, barely visible, but unmistakably human. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a delivery person or a stray dog. Still, I started double-checking the locks before bed, even though I hadn't worried about them much before. One Friday evening, after a particularly long day at work, I came home to the usual stillness. The sky was a dull gray, a light drizzle falling as I parked my car and hurried inside. I locked the front door out of habit, shook off my shoes, and headed to the kitchen. Dinner was simple, a sandwich and a cup of tea. I had planned to spend the night curled up on the couch, watching an old favorite movie for the 100th time. By the time I finished eating, the rain had picked up, tapping lightly against the windows. I settled onto the couch with a blanket and turned on the TV. The movie was a comforting distraction, its familiar lines and scenes making me forget the grayness outside. Halfway through, my eyelids grew heavy, and I began to drift off. But just as sleep was about to take me, a noise jolted me awake. It was faint, a light scratching sound, almost imperceptible, coming from the side of the house. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to stay calm. It's just the wind, I thought, or maybe a tree branch brushing against the siding. The sound came again, this time closer to the window. I sat up, suddenly alert. The TV's light flickered on my face as I muted the volume, plunging the room into an oppressive silence. The scratching persisted, slow and deliberate, moving around the side of the house. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was an animal, a raccoon or a stray cat. But deep down I knew better. The sound wasn't random. It had a purpose, a rhythm that sent a chill down my spine. When the noise moved to the back door, my stomach dropped. I froze, straining to hear every sound. The unmistakable rattle of the door handle followed, a sharp, metallic jolt that sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. Someone was trying to get in. Panic took hold of me. I realized with a sinking dread that I hadn't locked the back door when I came home. My mind raced, trying to decide what to do. My phone was on the kitchen counter, too far away to reach without making noise. I felt trapped, unable to move, as the rattle stopped and silence fell again. I held my breath, praying whoever was outside would leave. But the silence only made things worse. My ears strained for any hint of movement, my pulse thundering in my chest. Then I heard it, a low creak, the sound of the back door opening. The sound of the door creaking open sent a bolt of icy fear through me. My body refused to move at first, every muscle frozen as though pinned under the weight of terror. I forced myself to take a slow, shallow breath, my ears straining to catch every sound. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the back hallway. Someone was inside my house. I stayed low, pressing myself into the couch cushions, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. My phone was still on the kitchen counter, just out of reach. Every instinct screamed for me to run, but I knew any sudden movement could give me away. I had to stay calm, had to think. My gaze darted around the room, searching for something, anything, I could use as a weapon. The frying pan on the stove came to mind, but it might as well have been a mile away. The footsteps grew louder, each one echoing in the oppressive silence. They stopped for a moment, as if the intruder was listening, and then resumed, coming closer. I slid off the couch as quietly as I could, my bare feet touching the cold floor. My hands trembled as I crouched low and began to creep toward the kitchen. Every step felt impossibly loud, the creak of the floorboards threatening to betray me. I reached the edge of the kitchen counter and peeked around the corner. The faint outline of the frying pan was visible in the dim light from the stove. It was only a few feet away, but so was the sound of the intruder. He was moving through the living room now, his slow, methodical pace carrying him closer to where I had been moments before. My breath caught as I realized he was checking each room, looking for something or someone. I slipped behind the counter, my fingers brushing the cold handle of the frying pan. My palms were slick with sweat and the metal felt heavier than I expected. I gripped it tightly, forcing myself to stay silent. Then the footsteps stopped again. My heart thudded in the silence, each beat feeling louder than the last. He was in the living room, just on the other side of the counter. I could see his shadow moving on the floor, elongated by the dim light from the hallway. I swallowed hard, every muscle in my body screaming to run, but I held my ground. The shadow moved closer, the figure now stepping into the kitchen. He was tall, his frame filling the doorway. A hood obscured most of his face, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the room with a cold, calculating precision. For a moment I thought he didn't see me, but then his head turned sharply in my direction. Our eyes locked and I saw a flicker of recognition, or maybe amusement, in his gaze. The frying pan in my hands felt pitifully small, but it was all I had. Without thinking, I swung it with every ounce of strength I could muster. The pan connected with his head with a sickening thud, and he stumbled back, clutching his temple. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. Adrenaline took over, and I bolted toward the front door, my feet barely touching the floor. My fingers fumbled with the lock, the metal cold and unyielding under my frantic grip. Behind me, I could hear him recovering, his footsteps quick and angry. He was coming for me. Panic surged as I finally managed to throw the door open, the night air hitting me like a slap. I ran, barefoot and wild, into the dark street. The rain had stopped, but the ground was slick, and I almost slipped as I sprinted toward the nearest street light. My chest burned, and my legs felt like jelly, but I didn't dare stop. I glanced back once, half expecting to see him chasing me, but the street behind me was empty. My house loomed in the distance, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. I kept running until I saw the flash of red and blue lights. The police car screeched to a stop in front of me, and 2 officers jumped out. I could barely get the words out, my breaths coming in ragged gasps as I pointed toward the house. He's inside. The officers didn't hesitate. Guns drawn, they disappeared into the house while I collapsed onto the curb, my body shaking uncontrollably. The flashing lights felt surreal, their rhythm syncing with the pounding in my chest. Minutes passed like hours until one of the officers returned, his face a mix of concern and confusion. "There's no one inside," he said. "Are you sure you saw someone?" I nodded, my voice trembling. He was there. He tried to. My words failed me, and the officer gently guided me toward the back of the patrol car. They searched the house thoroughly, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no trace of the man I had seen. But I knew what I had experienced, and I knew I would never feel safe in that house again. The officers left after assuring me they would patrol the neighborhood through the night. Their presence should have been comforting, but it wasn't. As I stood in my now empty house, every shadow felt heavier, every creak louder. The silence, once my refuge, now felt suffocating. I walked through the rooms, my body tense and my mind racing. The back door stood ajar, its lock dangling uselessly where it had been forced open. The kitchen still held the frying pan it had, lying abandoned on the counter, its weight no longer offering any sense of security. The police may not have found anyone, but I knew what I saw. I knew he had been there. I thought about staying somewhere else for the night, but I was too exhausted to leave. Instead, I locked every door and window, double-checked them, and dragged a chair under the front doorknob for good measure. I left the lights on in every room, hoping they would push back the darkness. I even grabbed a kitchen knife and kept it by my side as I curled up on the couch, too afraid to go to my bedroom. Sleep was impossible. Every sound, whether it was the wind brushing against the house or the hum of the refrigerator, made my heart race. I kept replaying the night in my mind, wondering how I could have been so careless, how I could have forgotten to lock the back door. The image of the intruder's cold, menacing stare wouldn't leave me. His face, partially hidden under that hood, haunted me every time I closed my eyes. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. I woke up just as the sun was rising, its faint light filtering through the curtains. For a brief moment, I felt relief. The night was over, and daylight offered a small sense of safety. But the sight of my barricaded door and the frying pan on the counter quickly brought everything back. I wasn't safe. Not really. Over the next few days, I tried to return to normal, but the house no longer felt like home. I jumped at every sound, every movement outside the window. I kept the blinds shut and rarely ventured out, even during the day. The idea of going back to my routines, reading on the couch, cooking dinner in the kitchen, felt absurd. The quiet that I once loved had turned against me. I called a locksmith to replace the back door lock, but even that didn't ease my anxiety. I knew locks wouldn't stop him if he decided to come back. The memory of his shadow moving through my house, his deliberate footsteps echoing on the floors was enough to keep me in a constant state of alertness. It wasn't just the house that felt different, it was me. The sense of control I once had over my life was gone, replaced by a gnawing fear that followed me everywhere. I stopped sleeping through the night, waking at the slightest noise. Even when the neighborhood seemed perfectly still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. A week after the break-in, I made my decision. I couldn't stay here. The house, with its cozy porch and quiet charm, had turned into a prison. Every corner reminded me of that night, of the man who had invaded my space and taken away my sense of safety. I packed my belongings in a rush, stuffing clothes and books into boxes without much thought. Most of the furniture stayed behind. I didn't want anything tying me to this place. I found a small apartment closer to the center of town, where the streets were always busy and neighbors lived just a few feet away. The constant noise, once something I had wanted to escape, now felt like a shield. I told myself I would feel safe there, surrounded by people in motion. Even after I moved, the fear lingered. Every time I heard footsteps in the hallway or a door creak in the building, my body tensed. At night, I kept a light on in my room and slept with my phone within arm's reach. I never forgot to lock my doors, checking them 2, sometimes 3 times before going to bed. The intruder was never caught. The police didn't find any evidence, no fingerprints or footprints, nothing to suggest he had been there at all. But I knew. I knew he had stood in my kitchen, his shadow spilling across the floor. I knew the weight of his stare as he stepped toward me. That night had changed me, left scars I couldn't see but felt every day. I wanted to believe I had moved on, that the new apartment and the busy streets had given me a fresh start. But deep down, I knew the truth. The fear didn't stay in the house I left behind. It followed me, a shadow that lingered just out of sight, waiting for the silence to return. The forest stretched endlessly before me, an emerald labyrinth both inviting and mysterious. Hiking had always been my escape, a way to shake off the weight of city life and embrace freedom. That weekend, I set my sights on the Olympic National Forest, a place I'd visited only once but had always wanted to explore further. The cool autumn air filled my lungs and the leaves crackled underfoot as I adjusted my backpack and checked the GPS. The marked trail snaked ahead, framed by towering pines and moss-covered rocks. It was perfect, serene, untouched, and silent. Too silent, I thought, pausing to sip water. Normally, the forest would hum with life, rustling leaves, birdsong, or a squirrel darting across the path. But today, everything felt muted. Even my footsteps sounded muffled. I shook off the unease, blaming it on the unfamiliarity of the trail. Around midday, I reached a fork in the path. One trail was clearly marked with a wooden sign pointing toward a scenic overlook. The other was barely a path at all, just a faint impression in the earth, disappearing into the shadowy depths of the woods. I hesitated, glancing at my GPS. It didn't even register the faint trail. That should have been a red flag, but curiosity tugged at me. I had always prided myself on choosing the less traveled road, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity to explore something untouched by most. The deeper I went, the narrower the trail became. It twisted unpredictably, the trees closing in as their branches wove a dense canopy overhead. Sunlight barely filtered through, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the ground. A prickle of unease crawled up my spine, but I brushed it off. This was what I wanted, wasn't it? Solitude, adventure, the thrill of the unknown. By late afternoon, the trail had disappeared entirely, swallowed by a sea of ferns and fallen branches. I stopped to get my bearings, pulling out my GPS again. The screen blinked, useless and unable to find a signal. Frowning, I turned in a slow circle. Everything looked the same. Towering trees, moss-covered rocks, endless green. Panic began to creep in, but I forced it down. I had a decent sense of direction. I'd just backtrack, except backtracking didn't work. The landmarks I had noticed earlier, a crooked tree with a split trunk, a cluster of red mushrooms, were gone. It was as though the forest had rearranged itself behind me, closing in and twisting into an unfamiliar maze. My chest tightened, but I pressed on, refusing to give in to fear. "You've got this," I whispered to myself. "Just keep moving." The sun dipped lower, the golden light turning the forest into a patchwork of shadows. I quickened my pace, trying to retrace my steps, but the unease grew stronger with each passing minute. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every now and then, I thought I heard something. Branches snapping in the distance, leaves crunching underfoot. But whenever I stopped to listen, the forest was silent. As twilight settled, I spotted something through the trees. A structure. Relief washed over me as I hurried toward it, thinking I'd found some sort of ranger station. But as I drew closer, my relief turned to apprehension. It wasn't a station at all. It was a cabin, weathered and decrepit, with a sagging roof and walls blackened by time. A faint glow seeped through the cracks in the wooden shutters, suggesting someone was inside. I approached cautiously, my boots crunching loudly in the silence. The closer I got, the more out of place the cabin seemed. It didn't belong here, nestled so deeply in the woods with no visible trail leading to it. I knocked on the door, hesitant but desperate for help. For a moment, there was no response. Then the door creaked open, revealing an old man. He was gaunt, his gray beard scraggly and unkempt. His clothes hung off him in tattered layers, and his eyes, wild, piercing eyes, fixed on me with a mixture of suspicion and something darker. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice low and gravelly. "This place isn't for you." His words sent a chill down my spine. "I'm lost," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just need directions back to the main trail." The old man shook his head slowly, stepping out onto the porch. The air around him seemed colder, heavier. "There's no going back," he said, his tone almost regretful. "Not once you've come this far. You need to leave. Now." Something about his words, or the way he said them, made my skin crawl. But I was too exhausted to press further. I thanked him quickly and backed away, deciding to set up camp nearby rather than impose on his space. As I turned to find a clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, his wild eyes following my every move. I found a small clearing not far from the cabin, just beyond a line of dense, gnarled trees. The ground was uneven and damp, but it would have to do. I pitched my tent quickly, my hands trembling as the last hints of sunlight faded from the sky. The old man's words echoed in my head, "There's no going back." He had spoken them with such finality, as though he wasn't warning me, but stating a fact. As night fell, the forest transformed. The once inviting trees now loomed like skeletal sentinels, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The usual symphony of nocturnal creatures was absent. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, not even the occasional hoot of an owl. The silence pressed against me, thick and oppressive. I tried to shake off the unease. After a quick meal of trail mix and water, I crawled into my sleeping bag, leaving my flashlight within easy reach. I told myself I was overreacting, that my nerves were frayed from being lost. Still, it took a long time for sleep to find me, and even then it was restless and shallow. Somewhere in the dead of night, I woke abruptly. My chest felt heavy, as though the air itself had grown denser. I lay still, straining to hear what had pulled me from sleep. That's when I noticed it, the faint glow outside my tent. At first I thought it was moonlight, but the color was wrong, too dim and too yellow. Slowly, I unzipped the tent flap, peering into the darkness. The sight sent a shiver racing down my spine. Symbols were carved into the trunks of the surrounding trees. Each one intricate and alien, glowing faintly as though lit from within. I couldn't understand their meaning, but they filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. They hadn't been there when I set up camp, I was sure of it. A sudden rustling sound snapped me out of my stupor. My eyes darted to the edge of the clearing, and there he was, the old man standing motionless among the trees. He was too far away for me to make out his expression, but I could feel his gaze on me, cold and unblinking. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there like a shadow given form. "Hello," I called, my voice shaky and far too loud in the stillness. He didn't respond. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam toward him, but the light barely seemed to touch him, as though the darkness around him was alive, swallowing the glow. Panic surged through me. I scrambled out of the tent, grabbing my gear as quickly as I could. I didn't care about the time or how far I was from civilization. I just needed to get away from that man, and whatever was happening in this cursed forest. As I started walking, the forest seemed to change around me. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches tangling overhead to form an almost impenetrable canopy. The symbols became more frequent, glowing faintly on every other tree I passed. Their light seemed to pulse, drawing my eyes despite my fear. The path, or what was left of it, twisted unpredictably, leading me deeper into the woods. No matter which direction I chose, I couldn't seem to find a way out. I turned back at one point, thinking I could retrace my steps, but the clearing with my tent was gone. The forest had swallowed it, replacing it with an endless tangle of trees and shadows. Worse still, I could feel him. The old man wasn't following me, at least not directly, but his presence was everywhere. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I caught glimpses of him at the edge of my vision. A figure standing just far enough away to evade the full beam of my flashlight. His wild eyes glinted faintly in the dim light, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to pick up the pace, but the forest fought back. Roots seemed to grab at my boots and low-hanging branches tore at my clothes. The glowing symbols pulsed more brightly, their patterns growing increasingly intricate and unsettling. It was as if the forest itself was alive, herding me towards something I couldn't yet see. My breathing grew ragged, and my legs burned with the effort of pushing forward. Still, the sense of being watched never left me. The old man's presence pressed down on me, a weight I couldn't shake. No matter how fast I walked or how far I thought I had gone, he was always there, just out of reach, but always watching, always waiting. I don't know how long I had been walking. Time felt warped in the forest, each step blending into the next as the oppressive darkness deepened. My legs were trembling, my lungs burning with every breath. The symbols on the trees were everywhere now, glowing brighter with every passing moment. They seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heart, their strange patterns searing themselves into my mind. And then I saw him again. The old man stood directly in my path, his figure illuminated faintly by the symbol's eerie glow. His wild eyes reflected the light, glinting like cold steel. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stood there as if waiting for me to take another step. My flashlight shook in my hand, the beam flickering weakly against the unrelenting darkness. I opened my mouth to scream at him, demand an explanation, but no sound came out. My voice was trapped in my throat, swallowed by the oppressive silence. I turned sharply, veering off the path and pushing deeper into the trees. My only thought was to get away, to put as much distance as possible between me and the man who shouldn't have existed. But the forest wouldn't let me go. The trees grew closer together, their gnarled branches intertwining above me like prison bars. The symbols glowed so brightly now that I barely needed my flashlight, their pulsing light casting strange shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. The air grew colder, sharp and biting against my skin, and my breath came out in ragged, visible puffs. I stumbled over a root, crashing to the ground. Pain shot through my knee, but I forced myself back up. My movements were sluggish, my body rebelling against the unrelenting fear and exhaustion. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard footsteps, deliberate and slow, each one heavier than the last. I didn't need to look to know who it was. He was coming for me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was being hunted. I ran blindly, the forest twisting around me in ways that defied logic. The path I thought I had been following dissolved into nothing, replaced by an endless maze of trees and shadows. No matter which direction I turned, I ended up right back where I started. The symbols burned brighter now, their patterns shifting in ways that made my stomach churn. It was as if the forest itself was alive, conspiring to keep me trapped. Finally, my legs gave out. I collapsed in a heap, my body trembling with exhaustion. The flashlight slipped from my grasp, rolling into the dirt as its weak beam flickered one last time before going out. I was plunged into near total darkness, the symbols casting only faint, pulsing light. And then he appeared. The old man emerged from the shadows, his movements impossibly fluid and deliberate. He stood over me, his wild eyes gleaming with something I couldn't quite name. Pity? Triumph? I couldn't tell. His lips moved, but the words he spoke were unintelligible, a guttural, otherworldly language that sent shivers racing down my spine. Why? I finally managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. What do you want from me? He didn't answer. Instead, he knelt down, his face inches from mine. His breath was cold, carrying the faint scent of earth and decay. His gaze bore into me, freezing me in place. The symbols around us pulsed more rapidly now, their light intensifying until it was almost blinding. And then, everything went still. The man stood and extended a hand, not as a gesture of help, but as a command. I felt my body move against my will, rising shakily to my feet. My limbs felt heavy, my mind clouded as though I were no longer in control. He turned and began walking, and I followed, unable to stop myself. The forest around us seemed to shift, the trees parting to reveal a massive clearing. In its center stood a towering monolith, covered in the same glowing symbols that had haunted me throughout the night. The old man stopped at its base, turning to face me one last time. His expression was unreadable as he raised a hand and pointed toward the monolith. I stepped forward, drawn by an unseen force. The closer I got, the louder the symbols seemed to hum, their vibrations rattling in my chest. My vision blurred, and the air grew impossibly cold. My final thought before the darkness claimed me was that the old man had been right. There was no going back. The next morning, the clearing was empty. No tent, no footprints, no sign that anyone had ever been there. The forest had reclaimed me, just as it had countless others before. The symbols faded into the bark, their glow dimming as they waited patiently for the next lost soul to wander too far into the woods. It was a typical Friday night, the kind where the streets glowed faintly under scattered streetlights, and the quiet of suburbia felt both comforting and eerie. My shift at the pizza shop had been uneventful, the usual mix of rushed families and late-night snackers placing orders. By now, I could navigate the neighborhoods with my eyes closed, each turn and cul-de-sac etched into memory. My beat-up sedan hummed softly as I drove, the radio playing an old playlist I barely listened to anymore. The air outside was cool, autumn creeping in and crisping the edges of the night. I had 2 more deliveries before I could call it a night. The first was straightforward, a house I'd been to a dozen times before. The second was further out, in a quieter part of town where the houses were spaced further apart, their driveways long and shadowed. I didn't mind, though. These late-night shifts had a rhythm to them that I found oddly soothing. After dropping off the first order, I set off for the second address. The roads grew darker the further I went, the hum of city life fading into a stillness that wrapped around me like a blanket. It was peaceful at first, the kind of calm that lets your thoughts wander. But as I turned onto a long, empty stretch of road, something shifted. Far ahead, a car approached, moving fast. Its headlights were off, and it was barely more than a shadow against the faint glow of the streetlights. I frowned, easing my foot off the gas. My heart quickened as the car barreled closer, swerving slightly as if the driver was drunk or distracted. I gripped the wheel tightly, swerving to the side just in time to avoid a collision. The car roared past me, a dark blur in the night, and disappeared down the road without a second glance. For a moment, I sat frozen, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the road behind me was empty, the car gone as quickly as it had appeared. "What the hell?" I muttered, my voice shaking slightly. I took a deep breath and forced myself to focus. It was probably just some reckless driver, I told myself. Maybe a teenager showing off. Nothing to worry about. Shaking off the encounter, I continued toward my destination. The neighborhood I pulled into was quiet, the kind of place where porch lights flickered and leaves collected in untidy piles along the curbs. The house was easy enough to find, its number faintly illuminated above the garage. I parked in the driveway, grabbed the pizza, and headed to the front door. The customer was polite, if a little distracted, and I didn't linger. I was eager to finish my shift and put the strange encounter on the road behind me. As I walked back to my car, the silence of the neighborhood settled over me again, heavy and oppressive. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my boots. It wasn't until I was back in the car, the engine idling softly, that I noticed it. In the distance, parked on the opposite side of the street, was a car. Its headlights were off, but I could just make out the shape of it in the shadows, its dark silhouette unnervingly familiar. My breath caught, and I stared for a long moment, half expecting it to roar to life and speed toward me. But it didn't move. Forcing myself to stay calm, I backed out of the driveway and onto the road. The car remained still, its presence gnawing at the edges of my nerves. I turned the corner, and it disappeared from view, but the unease lingered, a knot tightening in my stomach. Something about it didn't feel right, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Just a coincidence, I muttered to myself, my voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Still, as I drove back to the pizza shop, my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror more often than usual, scanning for any sign of movement in the shadows behind me. I returned to the pizza shop, trying to shake off the unease from earlier. The warm glow of the fluorescent lights inside and the familiar sounds of the kitchen were comforting, grounding me back in reality. My shift was over, and I hung up my apron, grabbed my backpack, and waved goodnight to my coworkers. Outside, the air felt colder now, biting against my skin as I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat. The drive home started out normal enough. The streets were mostly empty, the occasional car passing by in the opposite direction. I kept the radio low, its soft hum filling the silence. But no matter how much I tried to focus on the road ahead, my thoughts kept drifting back to that car. The way it had sped past me without headlights, the shadowy figure of it parked across the street. It was just a coincidence, I told myself again, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. About halfway home, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. My stomach tightened, but I told myself not to panic. It was just another car heading in the same direction. I adjusted my speed, but the car behind me seemed to do the same, keeping the exact same distance. My pulse quickened, and a voice in my head whispered the thought I'd been trying to avoid. It's the same car. I tested my theory by switching lanes. The car followed. I took a random turn down a side street. It followed again. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands growing slick with sweat as I realized I was being followed. The unease from earlier twisted into full-blown fear. I glanced in the mirror, and my stomach sank when I recognized it. The dark car from before, headlights now on, glaring into my rearview mirror like twin eyes. I couldn't see the driver clearly, but I could feel their intent, the weight of their presence pressing against me. My thoughts raced. I had no weapons, no real plan, and the streets around me were empty. I couldn't lead this person to my home. That much was certain. I pressed my foot harder on the gas, the engine protesting as I sped through the quiet suburban streets. The car behind me responded in kind, its engine roaring as it closed the gap between us. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the wheel, my breathing shallow and fast. I turned sharply onto another street, trying to lose them, but they stayed close. And my panic grew as I realized I didn't know the area well enough to navigate. I was driving blind, hoping for an escape route that didn't seem to exist. The headlights bore down on me, and for a terrifying moment I thought they might ram into my car. Up ahead, I spotted a park. A small, open area with a loop road. Desperation took over as I veered into the park, cutting my headlights and pulling off the road behind a cluster of trees. I turned off the engine and held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly it felt like it would give me away. Through the gaps in the trees, I saw the car speed past the park entrance, its headlights sweeping over the road. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the steering wheel and praying they wouldn't double back. The minutes dragged on like hours, the silence around me amplifying every sound. Finally, the distant roar of their engine faded, leaving only the rustle of the wind and the hum of crickets. I didn't move for what felt like forever. My hands trembled as I started the car again, keeping the headlights off until I was well out of the park. The drive home was a blur, every shadow on the street seeming to hold that car, every sound making my breath hitch. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I couldn't bring myself to get out of the car right away. Instead, I sat there, staring at the darkened street, wondering if they were still out there, watching. I thought the worst was over, that it was just some random incident. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. This wasn't over, not yet. The days after that night were a blur of tension and paranoia. Every time I got into my car, my eyes scanned the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights trailing me again. My sleep was restless, interrupted by dreams of roaring engines and shadowy figures. I tried to convince myself it was over, just an isolated incident, but the knot of unease in my stomach refused to loosen. It was a quiet Thursday evening when I saw the car again. I was out on another delivery, the familiar routine doing little to calm my nerves. The address was in a quiet neighborhood with narrow streets and dim streetlights. As I drove, I felt that same creeping sensation I'd felt before, like I was being watched. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I turned onto the street. There it was, parked near the edge of the neighborhood, partially obscured by shadows, the same car. My breath caught, and for a moment, I considered driving past the delivery address, abandoning the order altogether. But I couldn't. I forced myself to pull into the driveway, my heart hammering in my chest. Grabbing the pizza, I glanced back at the car. Its engine was off, but I could feel the weight of its presence. As I approached the door, I heard the unmistakable sound of the car door opening. My panic spiked, and I knocked frantically on the door. When it opened, I thrust the pizza into the customer's hands. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling, "call the police. Someone's following me." The man on the porch, older and wearing a bewildered expression, glanced past me at the car. Without asking questions, he nodded and stepped inside, pulling out his phone. I turned back toward my car, just in time to see the shadowy figure of the driver step out. He was tall, his silhouette sharp against the dim glow of a nearby street lamp. His face was obscured, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and unrelenting. I backed toward the door, my pulse racing. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the heavy silence, and for a moment, I saw the driver hesitate. Then, without a word, he climbed back into his car. The engine roared to life, and the car peeled away, tires screeching as it vanished into the night. The police arrived minutes later, their flashing lights illuminating the quiet street. I explained everything, from the near miss on the road to the relentless stalking. The officers searched the area and promised to patrol the neighborhood, but their reassurances felt hollow. The man and his car were gone, and there was no evidence left behind. The following days were a struggle to return to any sense of normalcy. The car didn't reappear, but the fear remained, coiled tightly in my chest. Every time I turned a corner or passed a parked car, my heart skipped a beat, my mind racing with the possibility that it was him. Eventually, I stopped delivering at night. The risk wasn't worth it anymore, not after what I'd been through. But even in the safety of daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. The memory of his silent pursuit stayed with me, a haunting reminder of how easily the ordinary can turn into a nightmare. Though the driver was never found, his presence lingers in my mind, a shadow that refuses to fade. Even now, I can't look at an empty street without hearing the echo of his engine, or glance at a parked car without imagining it roaring to life. He's gone, but the fear he left behind remains, a constant, unshakable reminder of how close I came to something I'll never fully understand.